Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we step away from the noise of the day and into a place where time seems to move differently. Slower, softer, and full of quiet wonder. Imagine a valley wrapped in mist, where the air carries the scent of fallen leaves and the distant sound of a church bell. Lanterns glow faintly in windows, guiding travellers along winding lanes, and every corner of the countryside feels steeped in a memory older than you or I. Our story will carry us to a little corner of the world called Sleepy Hollow, a place where life moves at the pace of the seasons, and where the old Dutch legends seem to hum gently in the background. But tonight there will be no sudden frights or sharp alarms. Instead, I'll unfold the tale like a quilt over your shoulders, layer by layer, until you are warm, comfortable, and ready to drift. So find your resting place, perhaps with a cup of tea cooling nearby. Let the flicker of our candlelight be your only guide. Beyond the hills and across the bridge, we'll find a path into the quiet heart of Sleepy Hollow. And there, our story begins. In a quiet fold of the Hudson Valley, where the river broadens and slows before it joins the sea, there is a small district lying under a peculiar and agreeable enchantment. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land, as Washington Irving once wrote, and to pervade the very atmosphere. Here, meadows breathe the scent of hay and apples. Orchards lean over wooden fences, as if listening to the hum of bees and the turning of wagon wheels. The hills are softened with the gold and russet of early autumn, and the air holds the faint perfume of drying leaves. By day, the sun falls warmly on the sloping pastures, touching the river with a glitter that shifts and dances. By evening, the horizon deepens to rose and violet, and a pale moon begins its ascent over the stubbled fields. Lanterns glow at farmhouse doors, casting amber halos in the gathering dusk. A cart returns from market, its wheels murmuring over the dirt road, the horse's breath rising in gentle clouds. Cats wind their way along fences, pausing to watch the small rustlings of the grass. Sleepy Hollow, so named by neighbours who know its temperament, sits among low hills where elms stretch their limbs like dark lace against the stars. A winding stream curls through alder and willow, whispering softly over pebbles, carrying with it the first chill of October. Fences, built without the precision of town surveyors, lean in friendly acknowledgment toward one another. At certain gates, the hinges sigh in the breeze. From one chimney, a ribbon of wood smoke rises, straight in the still air, before dissolving into the twilight. The Dutch families who first cultivated these acres left more than barns and beams. They left a way of life, a set of customs and turns of speech, and the belief that stories deserve a place at every table. At crossroads and mill doors, tales have been told and retold for generations. Some with a smile, some with a shrug that hints at the uncertain line between truth and imagination. Irving described the hollow as a little valley, or rather lap of land, among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. It is a lap that welcomes wanderers, cradling them in foliage and river light, until even the most hurried traveller softens his step. To walk its lanes in autumn is to feel one's thoughts fall in step with the slow turning of the seasons. On such a night, the air holds a gentle hush. The moonlight rests like frost on the grass, though the temperature remains kind. Somewhere, a night bird calls. Far down the river, a boat's rigging answers with a faint creak. And always there is that undercurrent of calm, the spell that gives Sleepy Hollow its name, the spell we will linger under as we begin our tale. Before we wander too far into the winding paths of Sleepy Hollow itself, it's worth pausing to understand the mind that gave its name to the world beyond the Hudson River's banks. Washington Irving was born in 1783 in New York City, in the final months of the American Revolution. His boyhood unfolded in a young nation still shaping its own identity, blending colonial memory with a bold sense of new possibility. As a youth, Irving was captivated by travel, by the old stories whispered in port cities, and by a romantic pull of landscapes steeped in history. New York, in his day, was still small enough for a short walk to carry him from the bustle of the wharves into rolling farmland. He absorbed both worlds, the chatter of merchants discussing cargoes and the quiet rhythm of villages where news travelled as slowly as the tide. It was this balance, between the old and the new, that gave his writing its peculiar charm. In the legend of Sleepy Hollow, he blended local Dutch-American folklore with his own poetic descriptions, creating a place that felt at once familiar and touched by magic. He borrowed from European literary traditions, yet kept his settings grounded in the people and customs he knew from the Hudson Valley. In the early 19th century, the region was home to families whose ancestors had sailed from the Netherlands generations earlier. Their barns, houses, and windmills dotted the countryside, each built to endure both storm and season. They preserved their customs, autumn gatherings, winter feasts, and an affection for stories that mingled humour with a touch of the supernatural. Irving himself often travelled up the Hudson, staying with friends, sketching the scenery, and listening closely to local tales. Sleepy Hollow, in particular, seems to have drawn him again and again. He wrote of it not as a mere setting, but as a character in its own right, possessing a personality that was warm yet mysterious. In his words, it was a place of nature's own drowsy enchantment, where even the daylight seemed to soften, and the nights carried voices from the past. The America of Irving's time was still largely rural. Roads were dirt and stone, rivers served as the great highways, and the seasons dictated the pace of life. In autumn, the landscape became a patchwork of gold and red, a visual feast that inspired both celebration and reflection. The harvest season was more than an agricultural milestone. It was the social centre of the year. Families gathered to share food, music, and the telling of stories that linked the present to the distant past. Against this backdrop, Irving crafted his tale, a story of a lanky schoolmaster, a spirited young woman, a boastful suitor, and a figure who may or may not have been a ghost. By setting it here, in a valley already wrapped in legend, he ensured that Sleepy Hollow would remain forever, half in reality and half in dream. Our story begins in earnest with the arrival of Ichabod Crane, a schoolmaster whose appearance was as notable as his manners. Tall and exceedingly lanky, his frame seemed to lack any wasted portion, yet every movement was full of an awkward precision, as though he measured the air before stepping into it. Irving describes him as having shoulders that rose to his ears, long arms dangling a mile out of his sleeves, and hands that dangled a mile beyond. His head was small and flat on top, with large ears and a nose that jutted forth prominently. Ichabod came to Sleepy Hollow from Connecticut, a region then famous for producing itinerant teachers. He was, by all accounts, skilled in his profession, teaching children their letters, sums and psalms in a one-room schoolhouse, where the scent of chalk mingled with autumn breezes through open shutters. His discipline was firm, but tempered with humour. He knew that the affection of the community depended as much on charm as on authority. Outside of school hours, Ichabod made himself useful to the farming families, assisting with small chores in exchange for hearty meals. He had a prodigious appetite, a fact noted by every household that offered him a place at their table. A roast fowl, a pie, a tankard of cider, each was received with visible delight. In these exchanges he became part of the very fabric of the hollow, welcomed as a familiar figure on porches and at barn doors. But it was not only food that occupied Ichabod's mind. He had a taste for the supernatural, and would often read or recite tales of ghosts, witches, and wandering spirits. By candlelight, in the quiet of the schoolhouse after the children had gone, he would pore over volumes of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, letting the shadows in the corners grow deeper with each turning page. The Hollow, with its wealth of local legends, was a place perfectly suited to such a man. In time, Ichabod's eyes fell upon Katrina van Tassel, the only daughter of a prosperous Dutch farmer. Katrina was a blooming lass of fresh 18, with a lively wit and a playful manner. She was admired for her beauty, and for the substantial inheritance that would one day be hers. Fertile fields, fine livestock, and a comfortable home. Katrina was as skilled in managing suitors as she was in embroidery. She knew how to draw attention and how to keep it just beyond reach. Among her admirers was Brom van Brunt, better known as Brom Bones. Broad-shouldered and fearless, Brom was famed for his horsemanship and his mischievous sense of humour. He was the kind of man who could leap a fence on horseback and land grinning, ready for the next challenge. Brom was also fiercely competitive, especially where Katrina was concerned, and saw Ichabod as an amusing, if irritating, rival. It was within this small triangle of personalities, Ichabod the dreamer, Katrina the charmer, and Brom the boisterous, that the events of the Hollow began to turn. The harvest season approached, and with it the Van Tassels' grand autumn gathering. As the crisp days of October deepened, the Van Tassel farm prepared for the most anticipated event of the season, the great autumn gathering. Word spread quickly along the Hollow's winding lanes. There would be music, dancing, a laden table, and stories enough to keep the night awake until the stars dimmed toward dawn. The Van Tassel home stood proudly on a gentle rise, its broad Dutch gables outlined against the fading light. As guests approached, they could see lanterns swaying from hooks at the gateposts, casting warm pools of gold onto the path. The scent of roasting meats and spiced pies drifted into the chill, mingling with the aroma of hay and fallen leaves. Horses were tethered along the fence, their breath clouding the night air, tails swishing idly as they waited. Inside, the great room was alive with colour and motion. Quilts and woven rugs brightened the walls, their patterns echoing the careful hands that had made them. A long table groaned beneath platters of roast fowl, bowls of apples and nuts, mounds of golden cornbread, and pies whose flaky crusts revealed dark, fragrant fillings. The gleam of pewter and glass caught the lantern light, and the air was warm with laughter and conversation. Katrina moved through the room with practiced grace, greeting each arrival with a smile that seemed to hold both welcome and a hint of playful mystery. Ichabod, dressed in his best, though his lanky frame resisted elegance, was quick to offer compliments and to charm the older matrons with polite inquiries after their health. His appetite was as active as his tongue, and he sampled each dish with visible delight. Brom Bones arrived later, astride his powerful horse Daredevil. His laughter preceded him into the house, a sound as familiar as the creak of the floorboards. He clapped old friends on the shoulder, told a quick jest to a circle of young men, and cast a glance toward Katrina that was as much acclaim as it was a greeting. After supper, the musicians took their place, fiddles, a flute, and the steady beat of a small drum. Couples stepped to the floor, skirts swirling, boots tapping in time. Ichabod, surprisingly light on his feet, joined in with enthusiasm, his long limbs finding a rhythm that brought more than a few smiles. Brom danced too, his steps bold and confident, drawing cheers from his companions. When the music slowed and the chairs were drawn closer to the fire, the stories began. These were no mere recitations. They were performances honed over years, each teller knowing exactly when to pause, when to lower his voice, and when to lean in, so the lantern light flickered just so on the faces of his listeners. There were tales of Revolutionary War skirmishes, of lost travellers, of ghostly figures glimpsed along moonlit roads. But the favourite, the one saved for last, was the tale of the Headless Horseman, the spirit of a Hessian soldier said to have lost his head to a cannonball during some forgotten battle, who now rode the hollow in search of it. As the storyteller described the dark figure, the pounding hooves and the rush of wind as he passed, the room seemed to grow quieter, the shadows deeper. Even those who smiled at the thought of such a thing felt the familiar thrill of the telling. It was into this atmosphere, warm from the fire, yet tinged with the chill of old fears, that Ichabod would later step, making his way home under a moon just high enough to light the road ahead. The guests began departing in twos and threes, shawls gathered, hats dusted, lanterns lifted from pegs by the door. Outside the Van Tassel house, the night had clarified. Stars showed with a new sharpness, and frost made the grass glimmer where lantern beams reached the ground. Hoof iron rang lightly on stones as horses were led out to the lane, breath rising from their nostrils in pale, steady curls. Ichabod secured the girth of his borrowed steed, a steed more bone than muscle, stubborn in the hock, yet sound enough for a gentle road. Patting the animal's neck, he murmured something cheerful, a half-hummed scrap from a psalm tune, then swung into the saddle with more length than grace. He turned once to see the last window of the house, bright and companionable, then guided the horse towards the darkened lane, where hedges met over the track like joined fingers. The road dipped into a hollow where the air felt colder, and the scents changed from smoke and spice to water and leaf mould. The horse pricked one ear and then the other, choosing a careful line between shallow ruts. Above, a thin crescent moon hung at an angle, tilting its light like a spill from a silver cup. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a sheep bell sounded once, then fell still. The schoolmaster's coat flapped in a small private wind, and his hat brim caught a strand of moonlight on its edge. To keep himself steady of spirit, Ichabod spoke aloud of practical matters, lessons to set on the morrow, pages to mark, a hymn to introduce on Sunday, though his voice dwindled each time the lane narrowed and the boughs overhead touched, leaf to leaf, with the faintest of whispers. The maples had shed, but the oaks held their russet and bronze, and those tougher leaves rustled like the turning pages of a well-handled book. He reached the first of the little bridges, a plank span over a brook that never hurried, even in March. Water slid past the pilings with a voice that repeated itself, as if satisfied with a handful of words and unwilling to try new ones. Ichabod urged his horse forward, and the animal obliged, though it paused a heartbeat at the midpoint to test the boards with a hoof. On the far side, the lane rose again, and the rider found himself among pastures outlined by fences that had sagged into friendly curves. At a crossing where three paths met, a tulip tree stood guard, trunk ridged and broad, its great limbs thrusting outward like the arms of an enormous candelabrum. Irving had a fondness for such trees, those old sentinels that remember more stories than they shed leaves. Tonight, this one held the moon between two branches so perfectly that the light looked mounted there on purpose. Ichabod tipped his head to the tree out of habit, a polite acknowledgment learned from years in the country, where even the barns seemed to deserve greeting. He had not gone far beyond that living landmark when he saw a shape ahead, a mounted figure where the lane bent by a gate. The posture was upright, composed, neither beckoning nor blocking. The horse beneath the shadow shifted once, as if settling its weight, and then stilled. Ichabod's borrowed steed halted without being asked to halt, and offered a snort that might have been an opinion. "Good evening to you," the schoolmaster called, pitching his voice with neighbourly steadiness. "A crisp night for the road." The figure made no answer, yet neither did it turn away. Ichabod waited. He thought, for a curious instant, that the rider sat unusually high in the saddle, and then scolded himself for the thought, as one scolds a dog nosing the pantry door. He clicked his tongue and set his mount forward at a modest pace. The shadow moved, too, slowly, without flourish, and fell in behind him at a distance that could be read as courtesy. It would be an easy thing to call this pursuit, and some tellers later did. But the pace remained modest, the space between them consistent, and the sounds on the road, bits of grit crushed under hoof, leather creaking, iron tapping wood at a culvert, were the sounds of ordinary travel. Ichabod maintained his humming, though the tune wavered now and then, sliding off the line like a skiff nudged sideways by a current. The lane reached a long meadow, and the view opened. Fences made a neat geometry against the paler grass. A hayrick stood under a roof of thatch. The schoolhouse, far ahead, held a small square of starlight in one window, where someone must have left a shutter, imperfectly drawn. The shadow behind matched his progress, as a reflection matches a gesture on the surface of a quiet pond. When the road swung toward the old church bridge, the air cooled again. The beams of the span showed grey where wagon wheels had worn the paint away. The rail, polished by the hands of children and the elbows of idle men, gleamed dully under the moon. Irving had written, half in jest, half in homage to the ways of folklore, that certain spirits cannot cross certain thresholds. The notion returned to Ichabod now, like a remembered line from a lesson, and he felt a small cheer rise at the idea. He gathered the reins, and the horse answered with a surprised but willing step. The boards sounded hollow under them. 1, 2, 3, and then something thudded behind. A sound without vocabulary. Not hoof, not wood, not water, or perhaps a bit of each. A shape passed close enough that the air moved along Ichabod's sleeve, and for a fragment of a second he imagined the turn of a cloak where a head should have balanced. The horse broke into a rough canter across the last boards and fetched up on the far bank with the certainty of a creature that knows where firm ground begins. Silence took the lane after that. No pursuit, no jangle, only the brook reminding the bridge of old stories, and the wind resuming its quiet agreement with the hedges, when Ichabod turned in the saddle. Just once, just enough to be sure. There was only the bridge, and beyond it the tulip tree holding the moon, as calm as if it had done so every night since Noah's dove returned to the ark. He sat, breathed, and let his pulse settle into the pace of the river. What happened between the bridge and daybreak became a matter of community preference. A hat was found near the bank, and beside it a pumpkin broken into generous pieces, as if someone had meant to share a joke and then forgot the punchline. A pedagogue disappeared and later prospered in another county. A lively horse returned to its owner, bearing the dust of 2 roads and a satisfied tail. Brombones laughed whenever the subject arose, and never quite explained why. Katrina said little, and the Van Tassel kitchen remained as orderly as ever. Irving, with a courteous bow to ambiguity, let each neighbour keep the version that pleased him best. We will do the same. The night remains intact. The road intends no harm. The bridge keeps its secrets the way bridges do, with dignity and wood. Ichabod, whether near or far, stayed safely within the broad, consoling category of ordinary human fortune. He did not become a caution so much as a conversation. One more anecdote added to the Hollow's long shelf of agreeable mysteries. And the valley, which loves such things, found in the story a thread to braid into the rope of its autumn gatherings for decades to come. Morning returned to Sleepy Hollow, with a pale gold brushed along the east, and a breath of mist crowding low to the meadows. The Van Tassel farm came awake to the rustle of straw, and the soft thud of feed in wooden troughs. Carts set off toward the mill. Children recited lines on their paths to the schoolhouse. A dog stretched in the yard and decided to supervise rather than labour. Word travelled quickly, as it does where lanes cross often, and gossip finds a welcome perch. A hat had been found near the church bridge. The borrowed horse stood at its home gate, untroubled, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a long, opinionated stroll. In the kitchen, the kettle sang on the hanger, and an older aunt murmured that young men are like weather, changeable, occasionally dramatic, always returning to fair. Brom rode out with 2 companions, and returned with a grin stitched into both cheeks. No one pressed him, for the grin said more than any account might, and in any case the chores would not complete themselves. Katrina oversaw the pantry with her usual competence, moving from shelf to shelf with the calm exactness of someone who prefers order to questions. Irving's narrator, with a genial shrug, lets us stand at a polite distance while the village arranges its own conclusion. The old country wives, he writes, sit by the fire, with their little white caps under their chins, and knit their stockings, and talk over their favourite themes of ghost stories. A boy who has become a man recounts the night ride to a circle of friends as if it had occurred to a cousin. A visitor stops for a mug of cider and hears about a shattered pumpkin, with the satisfaction one grants a perfectly timed jest. Each October, when the first cold strokes the grass and the orchard rows show more branch than leaf, the legend is taken down, dusted and retold. It changes a little with every mouth that carries it. This teller prefers a gallop, that one keeps to a walk. One insists on hoofbeats, another on the particular tilt of a hat. Yet the core remains as durable as the church beams, and as elastic as the river's course from tide to tide. The place itself protects the tale. Lanes that curve around hedges, fields the colour of toast, fences that bend and still do their work. These encourage a mind to picture and embroider. Bridges help too. A bridge is a promise that one shore leads to another. And perhaps that is why so many stories take them as boundaries. What cannot cross must pause. What does cross must welcome a new sentence. As evening draws its blue shawl over the valley once more, windows brighten here and there, and the sound of a ladle knocking the rim of a pot sends dinner into bowls. Voices carry easily and stop before they become rude to the dark. The old tulip tree keeps the moon again, and the brook continues its faithful grammar under the bridge. Somewhere a fiddle practices a reel that will find its proper audience on Saturday night. We close where we began, with the land itself. The Hudson, broad and self-possessed, moves past without fuss. Reeds along its edge make their straw music. In this atmosphere, neither solemn nor careless, the legend lives the way good stories live, as hospitality for the imagination. If you walk the lane by starlight and hear an extra set of hoofbeats, you may smile and say that the night is playing at echoes. If a pumpkin on a sill seems to follow you with its carved gaze, you may praise the carver's hand and go on your way. Let the lantern near your door burn a while longer. Let the room behind you warm itself with a final log. Sleep comes easily in a valley that practices gentleness. Irving noticed that quality and left it for us in sentences that still glimmer. A drowsy influence, a sheltered retreat, a spirit that haunts more like a memory than a menace. Rest now. The story knows the road home, and the road is short.